I'm here tonight to talk about train wreck, all right? I'm not going to talk about the one train wreck a few miles from here. I'm going to talk about a train wreck that took place in 1923. And it is a true story, and I welcome any questions that anyone may have, but I just want to do a real quick overview of the story so that you have an idea about what it is if you haven't read the book, or if you haven't seen the movie, because that's coming out soon, and I'll talk about that as well. 1923 was a horrible time for China. It was what they call the Warlord period. You know, after the Qing government fell in 1911, there was competing warlords, one after another, all fighting for power, all trying to take control, over the country, and so the whole country was just fragmented. It was just a very, very bad time, for the country. But one thing that they focused on was developing the railroads. What the government was trying to do with the railroads was, the key thing was to unite the country. They also saw how the railroad was something that would drive commerce, would drive tourism, would drive trade. Importantly, it was to unify the country. But backing up, China was really slow to embrace the railroads. The first railroad in China was between the port of Wusong and Shanghai. It was an 11-mile track, and that was in 1876, and it lasted 1 year. And they ended up digging it up and throwing everything into the ocean because they saw that it was competing with the canal boat operators, with the farmers, and so there was a lot of reasons why China said, we don't want railroads. All right, now that was kind of a problem because transportation, in China was very difficult. I mean, the best way to get around was by, water transportation, rivers, canals, and so forth, but getting to Beijing was between Shanghai, and Peking was a 5-day journey, by boat. And that's assuming the weather was good. So when China was very, very slow to embrace railroads, come around 1900, there was only maybe 5,000 miles of track. In contrast, the US had 172,000 miles crisscrossing North America. Same with Europe. Every town in the US was connected by the railroad. And it drove commerce, it drove immigration, it drove everything. But China was slow, and so they started, we need to invest in the railroads. At the turn of the century, again, it was 5,000 miles. By 1923, they had developed more and more. And then what was called the Peking Express going north and the Shanghai Express going south allowed people to travel, between those cities at a predictable 36 hours. That's like, wow, 36 hours when, with the high-speed rail, between Beijing and Shanghai, it's 4.5, 5 hours. At that time, 36 hours was a big deal. It was a huge deal. The express trains were started in January of 1923. The government invested heavily in very sophisticated train cars, locomotives, and everything. And the train cars were technological marvels of the day. They were all steel construction. Around that time, there was a big problem with train wrecks, and what they had was what was called telescoping when there was a crash. And that was because most of the trains were made of wood. And so they got away from that, and they started having steel cars. The Chinese said, and it's the same thing they say today, is we want the best technology. So the Peking Express, top technology, all steel, and advertised, maybe falsely, but advertised by the American manufacturers as trains that were safe to take through bandit country. The journey begins May 5th, 1923. Now you have to imagine yourselves at the Shanghai Nanking railway station in 1923, and you would be hearing languages from all over the world, not just Chinese, multiple dialects of Chinese, but Japanese. And you would hear Vietnamese, you would hear English, German, Italian, French, all the European languages were represented. So you had people from all over the world. And so if you were sitting there and you would be reading your Carl Crow Handbook for China, this is the 1921 edition, all right? So you'd be reading it. While you're reading it, there's a whole section on bandits. The book says, all in all, travel is as safe in China as in any other part of the world. Robbers and pirates exist, of course, and there is usually a revolution or rebellion going on in some part of the country. But these things add zest rather than danger to your journey. So this is what the famous Carl Crow said, and he actually played a role in the story. But his handbook for China was actually Lonely Planet guidebook back then. It was the guidebook that you had to have if you were traveling. In that waiting room, when with all of these different businessmen, you had tourists from all over the world. In that audience were the movers and shakers of business. You had the sister-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., all right? She was on an around-the-world trip. It was her second time. Her name was Lucy Aldrich, and Lucy Aldrich was on an around-the-world trip to buy up antiques and Chinese fabric. So she was in that waiting room, people on holiday vacations. At that time, the U.S. had a military base in the Philippines. And so a lot of those expats that were living in the Philippines said, let's take a vacation to China. So there were families, military families, army families that were getting ready to board the train. So you had a lot of different people. You had the lawyer, who is a very well-known lawyer for the opium combined. So you had a lot of different people getting ready to board the train. So that's who was getting ready for the journey. And here's from passengers to hostages. A lot the movers and shakers from Shanghai, business folks. The woman with the Easter bonnet, that's Lucy Aldrich, from who was John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s sister-in-law. And then the guy on the far left is the lawyer for the opium interest. And then the guy at the bottom with the top hat, or not the top hat, the derby, his name was Leon Friedman. He was the top automotive dealer in China. He had dealerships all over China. He was the leading Dodge vehicle seller in China. So these are all the movers and shakers were getting ready to board the train. So we had the bandits. Now, this was a very, very interesting group of people. The bandits were a mixed group. In the bandit group, you had like ex-soldiers, disbanded soldiers, because as the warlords were fighting one another, what happened is when one army prevailed over another, they ended up disbanding soldiers. And unfortunately, these were guys that were armed, but they had no place to go, no jobs, no food. And so they ended up becoming bandits. You also had what were called China Labor Corps. There were workers that were sent to Europe to support the war effort in World War I. France and Britain had contracted to have over 200,000 Chinese go to Europe and support the war effort. These were guys that basically were digging the trenches, they were burying the bodies, and they also learned how to use modern machinery and weaponry. So they were very sophisticated individuals. However, when they came back to China, they didn't have jobs, all right? And so the warlords weren't interested in really integrating the former China Labor Corps workers. On top of that, those that worked in Europe actually came back knowing European languages. They spoke, not just English, but they spoke French, and they spoke some German. So they were very, very sophisticated. And then there was also the more hardcore, real bandits. There were the drug addicts, the opium addicts, and they were only interested in one thing, and that's just robbery, money, and putting food on the table. But the bandits were a mixed group. Now, the bandit leader, his name was Sun Miao, and he was one of the armies that was disbanded, and he wanted to go home. He wanted to go home, but the warlord from Shandong province said, I don't want you going home. And the warlord ended up murdering Sun Miao's brother, decapitated his head, hung his head on the village gates, basically as a message to Sun Miao, you're not welcome here. Sun Miao said, I've had enough. In the movie, which is, we're working on the script now, one of the key heroes is Sun Miao. There's a whole story behind him, but Sun Miao was considered to be kind of a good guy in some respects, but all bandits were kind of lumped together as being pure evil, rabble from, and the Chinese word for bandits was tufei, which means coming out of the ground, and that's the way they perceived the bandits were everywhere. So you have the bandits. The bandits were smart. They were very, very smart. Sun Miao was smart. Locomotives back then would only go about 40 miles an hour, the top speed. Not like the high-speed train going 300 miles an hour. So these things were relatively slow. And what Sun Miao did was he picked a location that was on an incline and a curve. And so the train actually had to slow down to about 10 to 15 miles an hour. And he and his men, there was over 1,000 men, that they derailed the tracks. They basically took out what's called the fish plates and the spikes. The tracks stayed there, so when the train came up the track at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, it looked like it was fine. But when it hit the spot where the fish plates had been removed, basically the locomotive just sank into the gravel. And then the cars behind the locomotive kind of fishtailed. No one was killed in the basically initial train wreck, although there was people killed with the gunfire, because the bandits then attacked the train, all right? And they attacked the train in 3 waves. The first wave is to get in and take the gold, the money, the watches, the valuables, and they needed that so that they could buy ammunition from the corrupt army. They needed the ammunition for their revolution. So that was the wave that came in. The second wave of bandits came in, and they took anything useful, such as blankets, pillows, pots and pans, anything that they can barter with the local villagers, because the villagers were going to help them escape to the mountains. And the villagers, when they saw blankets and fabric and pillows, they were like, yeah, so they just allowed them and supported them as they ran 35 miles into the mountains. And then the third wave of bandits came in, and they took hostages. And they took about 75 wealthy Chinese hostage who were in the first and second class cabins, and then they took the foreigners, about 25 foreigners from all over the world. And then that with 100 hostages, they started running for the mountains. What we had was a hostage crisis, and then it created where you had, rescuers came in from various governments to try to address what was going on and try to appease the bandits to negotiate a release. It ended up being a 37-day hostage crisis. Now, where the bandits took, the hostages was to this mountain here called Pazuku Mountain in Shandong province. And if you ever get a chance to go to China, it is something to see, because it's in the same condition it was in 1923. At the base of this mountain is a Taoist temple, a very famous Taoist temple, and that's where they were held for much of the 37 days. In addition to the rescuers, there was a lot of correspondence. And why? Because some of the hostages that were caught on the train were actually reporters. And what better way for a reporter to be embedded into the story is to be a hostage. So you had top reporters in China, a guy by the name of John Powell, and he's mentioned in the story in the beginning, and he actually played a very important role in both the story as well as the resolution of the thing. But you had reporters that converged on the location, and the role that the reporters played was so significant that they were the first to get the word out around the world. Keep in mind, there's no internet, and the way that the story got out was through telegram, through ocean cables. When John D. Rockefeller Jr. on a Sunday morning in Seal Harbor, Maine, was tending his garden. An Associated Press reporter came up to him and said, "Do you have a comment about the fact that your sister-in-law, Lucy Aldridge, has been taken hostage by bandits in China?" Rockefeller said, "That is baloney." He goes, "I have contacts in peoples and business every corner of China." You know, I mean, it is true. Rockefeller was all over China. In fact, 2 years before, he set up the Beijing Union Hospital. I mean, the guy's head was very, very invested. And so he basically told the reporter, "Get out, go away." He was a little nervous, so John Rockefeller called the Secretary of State, and he basically asked, "What's going on in China?" And the Secretary of State said, "I have no idea." And he said, "Well, I had a reporter come to me and say that there's been a hostage crisis involving bandits and my sister-in-law has been taken hostage." And guess what? I mean, the Secretary of State said, "Let me figure this out." Came back a few hours later and said, "The AP reporter, it's accurate. Well, we don't know where your sister-in-law is." So the correspondence played an incredible role in the whole story. 37-day crisis. You know, how does it end? For those that have not read the book, I'm not going to spoil it, but it doesn't end well for some, all right? For some. Overall, there was a lot of people that got away, were released, but it doesn't end well for some. I mean, this is John Powell here, so you know he got out. In 1932, nominated for the Best Picture was what is called the Shanghai Express. And the guy that wrote the script for the Shanghai Express, his name is Harry Hervey, who actually, in 1923, he was a cruise director on a boat in the ocean in Asia. And he was actually reading the newspapers like everybody else during the 37-day hostage crisis. So he wrote the script for the Shanghai Express. I mean, it's a little different, you know, so anyway. But the Shanghai Express was the highest grossing picture in 1932. People love train stories. It actually is a very interesting movie to see if you want to see some of the technology from that time. It was nominated for Best Picture. It didn't win Best Picture, but anyway, it won one Best Award. And now it is in the works for a new version of the film, and that is the director, Chen Daming, who is going to be the director for the film. And the producer is a guy named Chrisley, and he has produced movies like Philadelphia, Valkyrie, My Best Friend's Wedding, Superman Returns, and a whole lot of films. So the script's done, and they got the financing, and they're just moving forward with getting the talent, the production, and all that. So that's moving forward on that. So but it'll take a few years to get that done. That's my 15-minute overview of the story. Good to see you. I get to see you. So,
may I?
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Apologies, everybody, for being late. I think that sort of ruined my chances of being an extra in the film, which was sort of my draw for being here tonight. My name's Phelim Kine. I'm the China Indo-Pacific Affairs correspondent at Politico. I know Jim has been speaking for a while, but I just want to tell you and remind you this is such a rare treat to have somebody from Beijing come and talk about this book. I reviewed a lot of books for my old newsletter at Politico, and this one was one of my favorites over the last 3 years. It's a great read. It's a really rollicking tale. Thank you, as do many China watchers. You neither put a dragon on the cover or in the back, so that's really important. But let me just introduce James. James Zimmerman has been in Beijing for the last 30 years. He is a renowned China specialist, corporate lawyer. He is an indispensable lifeline as well for people who run afoul of China's dangerously ambiguous national security and secrecy laws. And he is also an excellent commentator on U.S.-China relations. So for him to be able to sort of bring this all together in a book about this event is really something. I have some questions for Jim. I read the book, and I'm always interested in process. I'm not a book writer myself. I know a lot of book writers. And a thing that comes to mind when I think about this book is I read a lot about China, Chinese history. I had never heard of this incident? I mean, for me, this is like this really, take it from your title, this sort of stunning collision of East and West in the 1920s in China. And I just wonder, number one, like, how did you learn about this? And number two, what made you think there was a book in this? Because publishers and agents always say, hey, maybe that's an article, not a book. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at that time period, a lot happened in the world, and there's a lot of things that got forgotten because of, the Japanese invasion, World War II, and then, China's own civil war, Cultural Revolution, everything, all that stuff that's happening. There's a lot of stories, from, early 20th century that just get buried. People forget and don't hear about things like the China's great train robbery. But there's a lot of stories. Now, how I came across it is because I'm fascinated by a number of topics. One, hostage diplomacy is something from a career perspective I'm very involved with. And so I'm also very much, interested in the role of the U.S. courts. The U.S. actually had what is called the United States Court for China. All right, people don't know this. It was actually a sitting U.S. court in Shanghai. You'd be like, what? Why would you have a U.S. court? But there was a court from starting in 1906, 1907, all the way until just after World War II began. And it was what they call an extraterritorial court. So I've done a lot of writing about that court system, and a lot of these stories come out of the court and the processes with the courts. One of the lawyers that was on the train was very active in the court. In researching, actually, I was most interested in the hostage process. What is China's history with hostage diplomacy and all that, and came across this story. I mean, nobody had written on it. And so I started not just researching in US, UK, and Chinese archives, but I decided to contact families of all of the hostages. And what I discovered was there are families that maintain boxes and boxes of records. And then one of the characters in the story, who was actually a US Army major who took his family on a vacation to China, he kept very, very detailed records for the full 37 days. He talked about the food that they had, what they wore, the attitudes of the hostages, who the good guys were in the bandits. As I tracked down the families, the grandchildren, they're in their close to 80s, and so the grandchildren were like, wow, you're really doing my grandfather a favor by writing this. And so I became friends with multiple families from all over the world. The daughter of one of the hostages was still alive, and she's in Paris, and so I got a lot of letters, family letters, that had not seen the light of day. The letters and those diaries was very, very important to put myself in the shoes of the hostages. And that was very important. And some things were published, like Lucy Aldrich, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s sister-in-law. She actually wrote a story. Her time was limited. She was only hostage for about 2 days, 2.5 days. The others went over the full 37 days. And the detail in the family records was pretty amazing. So I knew I had a story to tell when I met the families, and I had all those family records because nobody else had that stuff. So that to me was really important. And the more I talked to the families, they were saying things like, we've been praying for somebody like you to come along and write my grandfather's story. I'm like, well, so I almost felt obligated, but that was the origin of that. And for those like myself who are very fascinated with that early 20th century, there's so many stories. I'm not going to live long enough to write a lot more, but I've got a list of 10 stories, and maybe 2 more I'll be able to get done. But yeah, there's a lot of stories that have to be told about people that were in China. And it's not just the stories of foreigners, but the story of Sun Miao is incredible. Switching subjects.
Yeah.
I think if you have a question about what the government's reaction is, I can answer that.
Go.
Yeah.
I have a question about the government's reaction.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to say, as someone does some minor research, I mean, to be able to this gold mine of primary documents from the survivor, from the descendants, is just amazing.
Yeah.
So I want to look at this from the perspective of, this is an incident in which it was unflattering for China at the time, which is the Republic of China. And of course, the Chinese government, or various Chinese governments, are extremely sensitive to such issues. So far, you have not been accused of historic nihilism, which I think is a crime. You haven't been, pun intended, run out of town on a rail. But I just wonder what the reaction has been from the Chinese government in terms of this story. They obviously aren't trying to cover it up. Are they ignoring it? How do they feel about the story?
Well, I mean, the first thing is Mao himself, in 1925, brought up the incident as an example of how bad the warlords were and how, starving, and the bandits were basically just starving people, So Mao himself brought this up. So it was important for, in some respects, the party, but they don't see him as a hero, so to speak. But one thing is the book, the English version of the book is available now. In talking with the importer of the book, I said, well, how did you guys manage this? Because, history, politics, from outside, it's very hard to get into the country. And so they first said, well, it's a story about train technology. And I'm like, really? 1923. But that was one of the excuses that they used to get it in. But the support from the government has been fabulous. Wow. All right, so two things I want to mention on that. The Shandong government, where this all happened in what's called Zhaozhuang, where they've actually, some of China's famous railroad movies all centered in that part of the country. I took a group of media reps down there for the 100th anniversary. That was May 5th and 6th weekend in 2023. So that was the 100th anniversary. And they put on a banquet. And at the banquet, one of the guests of honor was the grandnephew of Bandit Sun Miao. All right, so he was there, and he's a very successful businessman. He runs a company that does actually a lot of stone products. So very, very, well-to-do guy. So it was he and I, and basically he outdrank the hell out of me. But he and I were kind of the guest of honor. And so in that event, I asked him, what is the family lore about Sun Miao? What did you hear? Because I'm not going to give it away, but he didn't survive after 1923. So what have you heard about him? What did people hear? What were the stories? And he said, well, he was considered a man of the people. He was considered somebody that was sticking up for the little guy when the warlords were slaughtering everyone. So he was kind of a local hero. And then I asked him, I asked the grandnephew in front of, 3 officials of the Shandong government, I said, do you consider your great uncle to be a hero? At that point, the whole room was dead silent. And then he looked at me and he goes, well, I can't answer that. And then the government officials are like, no. And I'm like, okay. Officially, he's not a hero, because being a hero to the party is a whole different category. So he's gaining more and more respect. But I can tell you, when I started doing research on the book in 2015, nobody at the local level was helpful. It was not a story they wanted to talk about. And the cab drivers, when you asked them about the bandits, and they said the bandits are the heroes, the real bandits are the party. They have that kind of a discussion. But in 2023. There's up at the mountain, Paozuku Mountain, there's a whole plaque about the whole incident. And so it's now an issue of tourism. So they've said that they're going to promise to the filmmakers that they can use the sites and they can support the film, because actually the architecture, the key architecture, which is the train station, still there. What's called the mining compound where the rescue operation was, still there. The temples, the 2 temples, including the one at the mountain, top of the mountain, those are all still there, almost in the same condition they were in 1923. So the government is very, very supportive. Now, the final point on that, in my day job, I get called in for tea a lot. I mean, so when the book came out, my handler had a copy of the book. She basically said, "Would you sign it?" I said, "Of course I would." I said, how did you buy it?" And she said, "I bought it on Taobao. It's available in China." So this, I mean, is the MSS, you know, and they are very, I mean, MSS is the security people. I don't want to say they're supportive, but they're not getting in the way. You know, and that's a good thing. Now, the director and the producer, I'm trying to get them not to change the basic story, but they will make the heroes will be not the warlords. And mostly the heroes are going to be the bandits. The foreigners are going to play a role, but not as, I mean, Sun Miao will come off as a really good guy. When you look at the Shanghai Express, you know, the Chinese were, I mean, actually they didn't even have ethnic Chinese playing the roles of the Chinese. I mean, they had white people dress up as Chinese. It was actually embarrassing to watch the movie. But anyway, the heroes in this are going to be the bandits, the Chinese, the bandits. And some of them will be funny just because they were goofy and they did goofy things, but then also there's going to be, you know, true heroes. Anyway, so that's the answer on the government.
Amazing research, amazing book. What's next for James Zimmerman? What do we got? Can you tell? Obviously, the film is coming up. What else have you got in the cooker?
I have a list of 10, but I've got 2. One's done, except it's going through the editorial process. And that book is on, it's 1907. It's a true nonfiction story. Right now the title is called The Foreign Devils. And the bad guy is a former legation guard, American guard at the embassy in Beijing. That was at the time was a legation, but he ended up murdering a woman. She was a former Broadway opera star, but murdered her in Hong Kong, tried to stuff her body into a trunk and sink it into Hong Kong harbor. I mean, the story is really about the manhunt. Yantai, I mean, if you get a chance, this is a really cool city because it used to be called Chefu. And the architecture, and to China's credit, the architecture remains the same, and it's a really very, very impressive. But the bad guy, the legation guard, actually ran, after he left the guard, he started a fight club and tavern. And so he was part of the underworld, you know, and so the American underworld, they were really bad guys, you know. So anyway, but to make a long story short, in the court that I talked about, one of the first things this U.S. court did when the guy was captured, there was no laws on extradition. So the U.S. court authorized that this suspect be kidnapped by the U.S. Navy, and then he ultimately went to Hong Kong and tried and convicted in Hong Kong. But anyway, that book is coming out probably sometime in fall to the late next year. And then another book I'm working on called The Death Caravan, which is a story about a reporter that wanted to cover the Japanese-Russian war, and he took a camel caravan up to the Russian border and he disappeared. The story is really about his brother that comes, follows his steps and solves the murder. And it ended up being a guy that was on the caravan with him who was from France. And so anyway, that's called The Death Caravan, but I'm still working on that. And the interesting thing about that story is they never found his body, but his family built a schoolhouse up in Inner Mongolia, and I'm right now trying to find the schoolhouse. Yeah. So the book will end finding the schoolhouse for that. Anyway, so those are the 2 I'm working on.
I'm a little bit lost on the Chinese government reaction. They actually don't want the book to be published, known in the country. But back in 1923, that CCP was not even really established, so why they have that kind of reaction?
Well, back then the reaction was, the government at the time was very, very negative towards the whole incident. But today, there is a Chinese version that's coming out very soon. It's going through an editorial process. As far as I know, the publisher, which is based in Shanghai, there's been no request to edit the book in any way that would impact what I wrote. So the Chinese version is coming out. There's been a lot of support from the Chinese government in terms of the story because it's a good story for China because that time frame was horrible. The warlord period was horrible. So I do think the government is definitely was supportive in a lot of ways, and they continue to be supportive. And we'll just have to see how the movie plays out and whether the support will continue. But I do feel that there's a lot of interest because from what I understand, within China, there has been some documentaries done, like in the 90s, about the basic story, but a little from a different perspective. It was more of from the perspective that the foreign governments put too much pressure on the Chinese government at the time, to negotiate. At that time, the warlords wanted to go in and wipe everybody out. Their solution to the crisis, if they had their way, it would have been a 3-day crisis and not a 37-day crisis. And they wanted to go in and wipe out the bandits, but the foreign governments were like, no, you need to negotiate, And so most of the academic critiques by the Chinese government was been to the pressure that the foreigners put on them. But overall, I mean, in terms of how I've told the story, they've been very, very supportive.
So this book involves hostages, and I mentioned at the beginning that Jim spends a fair amount of his time helping people who have run afoul of the authorities in China. And I just wanted to ask Jim about 2 particular people who he has spent a lot of time trying to get back home, U.S. citizens. They go by the name Nelson Wells Jr. of New Orleans and Don Michelle Hunt of Chicago. Could you speak to their situation?
Yeah, in my day job, I'm very active, human rights related issues. It's been like a team effort in both the U.S. and China to encourage a couple of American citizens that are in prison to be released. We've been really pushing to have this done. The State Department actually submitted a humanitarian request on May 16th. So the humanitarian request, you don't challenge the underlying cases. You don't say, oh, they're wrongfully detained or whatever. You're really not supposed to, because you just say, look, these people are in such bad health. I mean, they're very, very, very sick. And they've been incarcerated for over a decade, both, and they should be released. So, and the Chinese side has shown an interest in that. But one of the things that's confused my discussions with the Chinese, the request for humanitarian release was made on May 16th. It was the same day that the Secretary of State got on TV and started talking about restrictions on visas. It kind of got buried in the discussion. The Chinese officials I talked to, they're saying, like, what is America's priorities here? What are your priorities? You make this request, but at the same time, you pound us with tariffs, you pound us with, issues on student visas and all that. So, so the messaging I'm getting from the Chinese government side is we want to hear from someone close to the top that will tell us that this is important for the U.S., for the American people. We lobbied and lobbied and lobbied to get it on the agenda for the Trump-Xi Jinping call last Friday. We lobbied hard, and we even had, former Ambassador Max Baucus, who was lobbying. And unfortunately, the president did not bring it up on the call. He was fascinated by the parade and talked about the parade and all that, talked about TikTok and whatever, but it was never brought up. And even my contacts within the Chinese government said, we hope we can still do this. So then our next strategy was there was a congressional delegation. And the congressional delegation, we wanted to raise it and bring it up. So we've been working very, very hard to get the messaging so that they can be released. And if I was to look into the crystal ball or to read the tea leaves, I think it's going to happen, but it's just a matter of time. But it's been a really fabulous effort. And you wrote a story about it, which was really very, very helpful in raising awareness of it. I mean, we also have some people in this room that were very, very engaged in the whole lobby process as well. So we're doing what we can to get them released. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, because these people are very sick, but it's good for U.S.-China relations. The optics would be really good for China. And in the Chinese officials that I met with, I gave them a 3-page list in Chinese about why it all makes sense for China. And they get that. And they say, yes, it would be a good thing. But it's like, do it then. Let's get this done. And it's going to be a timing issue, but we're still trying to raise the level at a higher level, and trying to get the attention span from the White House. It's been challenging, but, fingers crossed. But thank you for bringing that up. We do a lot of things, and don't let anybody tell you that, human rights issues are just an American thing. It makes sense for China too. If we want to go back to 2015, 2016, which is my dream, is to go back to when we were talking about the bilateral investment treaty, TPP, the cybersecurity agreement. We had dialogues with the Chinese side. We need to talk. Now, that may be a pipe dream. A lot of people say, it's not going to happen. I'm a strong believer that there is room for engagement, and there is a lot more opportunities. But thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for all of you here.